So, good morning, everyone. My name is Natasha Lemus-Dekker, and together with Mari Lobosco, I'm organizing the 7th MICE. Also, on behalf of Mari, I wish you all a very warm welcome to Lisbon. I must say, when I started as a MICE coordinator last year, it has always been my dream to bring the MICE to Lisbon and to the sun, which has left us today. But this year we succeeded, so I'm very glad with that. And it goes without saying that we are very grateful to the Institute for Social Sciences, the ICS, here at the University of Lisbon, for their generous financial support and for hosting us. This year we will have 2 exciting keynote lectures, one by Professor Arthur Kleinman and one by Professor Cristiana Bastos. In addition, we will have the opportunity to enjoy a workshop by Elizabeth Chandler on academic writing and a workshop on methodological questions on temporalities by Simone Frangella. We have chosen to continue with the discuss and peer review structure that the MICE has been using for a couple of years now. And so instead of listening to one-sided monologues, we hope to all engage in productive discussions. During the conference, you'll find a book stand in the hall with the latest titles of medical anthropology from Bergham Publishers. And we would also like to take this opportunity to thank them for once again showing their support to the MICE with their contribution to this conference. Finally, we would also like to thank you all for sending in your abstracts, for being willing to share your work, and for being here together. We hope you will have the time to explore this beautiful city, to contemplate the day's sessions, and continue discussions over good food and wine. That's when most brilliant ideas come up. And so we hope the MICE can be a platform for creative, critical, and productive thinking and productive exchanges together, that new friendships and partnerships may arise from these encounters. And we look forward to get to know all of you and your impressive work. Thank you.
So thank you, Natasha, and welcome to all of you. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Cristiana Bastos, an anthropologist and permanent researcher here at the Institute of Social Sciences. She is a prominent figure in the medical anthropology in Portugal and abroad, and she has taught and worked in Portugal, in Brazil, and also in the United States. Professor Bastos' research interests are diverse and transversal, and her work is often at the intersection of anthropology, history, and science studies. Her doctoral research, for example, focused on AIDS as a global and public health issue in Brazil, on which she published the book Global Responses to AIDS from Indiana University Press. Other topics she has engaged with include therapeutic practices and social uses of spring water in Portugal, and tropical medicine and its connotation as instrument of knowledge and power during the Portuguese colonial empire. She recently received an ERC advanced grant for a project, The Colors of Work, The Lives of Racialized Migrants, which will study the transnational flows of migrant Portuguese workers from the Atlantis island of Madeira and the Azores in the post-slavery period. And today, her lecture is based on one of her fieldworks, which is about a collection of wax figures located in the Hospital of Desterro, which is one of the major hospitals here in Lisbon. These figures reproduce pieces of human body with skin lesions caused by syphilis and other sexually transmitted infection. So through the study of this material and the history of hospital care and policies of treatment of syphilis, Professor Bastos will bring us to understand the temporalities and different forms of treatment, containment, and prevention of infection diseases. So thank you.
If you don't mind, I'm going to speak from here so that I can pass the slides. I hope you're not too sensitive to some of the images. Some are a little bit scary, but that's also the point. At this moment, I am finishing an article in which I'm making a point about the aspects of those images, and maybe your feedback will be incorporated in my final. I'm like in the last few days of the second version of submission. So I'm very thankful that I can share with you recent research. I am delighted that the maze is happening here. I'm very proud of the work of Mariko and also Francesca and Ricardo and André that are also supporting you outside. Thank you, Natasha, for willing to come to Lisbon, and thank you all for having come. I wish you a very productive 2 days and also some leisure in between. By the way, some of the places presented in the lecture will be visited by you tonight, by coincidence. Maybe not so much by coincidence. There's some convergence of, say, leisure activities in some parts of Lisbon. So I'll tell you what it is all about. I try to respond to the question of temporalities and generations by bringing in data and reflections from 2 lines of research that I engaged with. One is about the AIDS epidemic, and the other is about an historical approach to syphilis. Okay, so that's what I'm going to present today. Then I will focus on some visualizations of syphilis and the venereal disease and some of the policy aspects that surrounded the prevention and treatment of syphilis. And we will see, and then you'll think about it, you can ask me about it, or later on you can talk more about it, how some of the structures organizing prevention, treatment, and separation remain from some epidemics to others. Okay, so let's go into the topic. A brief chronology of AIDS. You are, as young scholars that you are not a witness of the times of the early appearance of AIDS in the 80s. Okay, but this is a very powerful image when North American activists put on a quilt, a mega production using its also an artistic form that represents the expensive and extensive suffering of so many people. Each piece of this quilt represented a dead person. And this was at a time when the government in the US would not use the word AIDS. It wasn't there, it wasn't officially there, but it was there because it was ravaging large numbers of people. So a brief chronology, probably, maybe it's familiar to some of you, but not necessarily. It appeared as a medical entity. Not that it didn't exist before, as we know today. There were people infected since probably the 50s, having a combination of infections that led them to die of lung disease, general collapse, and so on, in many places. And mostly in Central Africa. Already in the 60s and 70s, there were cases. And there was probably, as we know now, a lot of iatrogenic transmission by injections, by good-willing actions of health professionals. There was also transmission of the infection. But we don't know all the details. We only got to get the entity of a new disease in the 80s. And there was a lot of resistance. And I put these images of the New York native because they epitomize how within the group that was most visibly affected, the gay men in New York, there was at least one newspaper that said there's nothing as AIDS, it's all our fault, we're too promiscuous and so on. And even later in the late 80s, they were against the only drug that there was available, which was AZT. When facing new epidemics that there are at the moment, Zika, chikungunya, and so on, if you remember the history of AIDS and the history of syphilis, as I will share later, you may find these patterns coming again and again. It's the pharmaceutical industry that's making up a disease. Well, it may be profiting from a disease or expecting to profit from a disease, but it doesn't give you, the public and the newspaper, the immediate certitudes that they're making up something. You have to always look at what there is, otherwise you come out with catastrophic outcomes, which is also what happened with the New York Native. The paper was that most of the staff abandoned it because the director was denialist, and then he kept being denialist all by himself, and the newspaper went on, and then other activist groups took the role of responding to AIDS effectively. Okay. In the 80s, it's medicalized. It comes up not as a gay plague, not as a sin of bad behavior or anything, but as something that the medical establishment, the medical laboratories, biomedicine, and all most cutting-edge research would take care of. A virus, a new virus. Retrovirus was then kind of a new concept. A virus that comes out of RNA, goes into DNA, and then goes into infecting. And it was, from the perspective of history of science, very fast that science came out with a model that could explain it. Transmission by body fluids, and the response from a biomedical perspective is let's develop antiretrovirals. Okay, it's very short from the perspective of history of science, but it's very long from the perspective of people that are in the field living it, people that are counting their months or weeks of life with a disease that nobody could really treat. So the communities came out with other strategies of enduring the disease, getting alternative drugs, spreading prevention, sometimes beyond the law. I don't know how many of you are familiar with United States law, but it's forbidden to just get a syringe, to get it infected, to get it clean, to do your drug injection. It's an extreme prohibitionist attitude. So the very fact of giving out clean needles was enough to put you at risk of going to prison. So this was activism, grassroots activism, hardcore in the AIDS epidemic that happened very fast. During the 80s, all of this happened. And don't want to take all the time with AIDS. By the late 80s, there were some antiretroviral therapies that weren't that effective, but they were enough to change the quality of life of some people. They were very expensive, and one of the things that I want you to also see is that people would fight for drugs. This was a demonstration in front of the Wall Street stock exchange to pressure the drug company that produced AZT to lower their prices. Okay, this is history. This is from my generation to yours. I was a life witness of this, and you will benefit from knowing what was the sequence of events and what was the structure behind this in order to face the multiple new challenges to global health that there are out there, not just out there, everywhere. I'm not being paranoid. There are enough new epidemics around us to make us need to be very prepared to have the most complex and ethnography-based response to them. Okay. 90s new therapies all happen very fast from an historical perspective, very slow from the perspective of people living with this. Activism goes global. UNITES didn't come out of thin off the air. It was a convergence of the agencies that could see that you cannot take a decision about AIDS prevention in, say, Mozambique, and then have the World Bank saying structural adjustment doesn't allow you to whatever. So UNITES was something that emerged out of a lot of pressure, including pressure from patient-based activism and from health workers and from all of those involved with AIDS work. And the biomedical landmark, really the landmark, was the triple cocktail in '96. Now, in the 2000s, we have generalized activism, and you have a sort of, I'm not going to develop much on this, but denialism continued with its own reasons. For the same reasons, the people in New York were not ready to have the blame on their group, and transformed the resistance to being identified with the disease. Many African leaders also rejected being called the AIDS carriers. That was also very catastrophic in some senses, because it prevented therapies to arrive to people in due time. Okay, this is over. The struggles for therapy get new configurations now. Right now we have incredibly good analytical work on how these new configurations of therapy and adherence and resistance, or other names that you can, other concepts that you can find to work on it. You have Bill's work, you have Ngoyan's work, you have exciting work in the field that's going on. Even Francesca Cancellieri here, from years later on, presenting what's the problem with the intergenerational AIDS activism in Mozambique. So this is a brief history of AIDS, okay? And we have generations of representation. Just briefly remember how AIDS appeared in artworks, in exhibitions, and so on. And now we have a much wider chronology that I'm going to present, which is the one of syphilis, which is not a public health problem the way AIDS was in the 80s. Apparently had been solved or resolved or stopped by the advent of penicillin, which is a good treatment. It's still there, but it may come back in different ways, but that's not the issue. The issue is to look at some constancy, some patterns in the two epidemics that I want you to think about, okay? So this is a much longer chronology. Supposedly, this is Albert Dürer representation of the syphilitic man. It's attributed to Dürer, and it's dated from the late 15th century, okay? So that's when syphilis is acknowledged as existing in Europe, and it was attributed to stars and to conditions of the atmosphere and of the cosmos. We think now that syphilis came to Europe first after the traveling through the Atlantic, and there's an approach to the issue which refers to the Columbian exchange, which is the Europeans brought smallpox, variola, and flew to the New World and brought from the Americas syphilis back to Europe. There are debates whether there was syphilis before that, because there are findings, archaeological findings, with lesions on the bones that are similar to syphilis, much before there was a Columbus or any traveling over the Atlantic. But what is more consensual is that the form of syphilis, the spirocheta, the variation of spirocheta brought from the New World with the overseas traveling in the late 15th century was what brought the new epidemic to Europe. And from then on, it became super intense flagell and permanent, less an epidemic, like a new endemic that was very, that had a high impact, okay? So this was syphilis. In the 16th and 17th century, it was very intense. It caused extreme symptoms. Medical historians say that it became less virulent with the centuries, but in the 17th and 18th century, it still caused strong alopecia. People lost their hair, got a lot of bubbles and rashes, and then lost their nose, their gums got all corrupted, the teeth fold, and then you had primary, this was secondary, and then tertiary syphilis, you got syphilis madness, okay? So it was no small deal, and it was known as being sexually transmitted. It was also wrongly known as being hereditary. Until the 20th century, people thought that syphilis could be inherited. We know now that it's not the case. You can get it, you can transmit it during pregnancy, but you cannot transmit from one generation to the other in the genes. People still think you can, and there was a lot of added stress to the epidemic because of that knowledge that we now know. It wasn't the case. Early treatments, I briefly mentioned the AIDS treatments, and the early treatments were guaiacum brought from the Americas. It was a treatment that went on and off, and like many other treatments, it had many purposes. Apparently, it would diminish the bubbles and some of the lesions of syphilis. And then the big treatment was mercury. Everybody has heard One Night with Venus, the entire life with mercury, and you injected or rubbed mercury in patients. So we now can know from some body remains when they were probably treated for syphilis, because mercury causes long-term effects in the skeletons. So you can find entire families with syphilis in graves, but it's not. It remained until the 20th century in more sophisticated forms. In the clinical records I researched, they're always talking about the gray oil, and the gray oil is one of the mercury derivatives. There were oils and creams, there were injections, and then there were pills, which were used through the 20th century. So another thing is, one treatment, when it comes out, you generally look at history of medicine and see, oh, then came arsenic and replaced everything, and then came penicillin and replaced everything. Not true. Things remain being done, as the miasma theory remains there, even though it's been long dismissed by germ theory. When the first AIDS narratives reported the bathhouses as a focus of infection, there you go, it's like miasmas. There's a place that's infective. There's infection in the atmosphere. So cognitive models and therapeutic tools remain beyond the changes in paradigm, the changes in the innovations, and so on. So mercury persisted in spite of the revolutionary uses of Salvarsan in around 1909, 1910. It's a remedy, it's a medicine that's close to atoxyl, used for sleeping sickness. It was developed in Germany in the collaboration of a Japanese researcher and a German researcher. Now the history credits the German researcher and erases a little bit the role of the Japanese researcher. History of science is often biased and ethnocentric, but now there's a sexist. Now there's an effort to acknowledge the work of women that were behind big discoveries and non-European partners that were behind many discoveries, and this is one of the cases. Association by Hatta and Paul Ehrlich. Okay, Salvarsan was revolutionary. People came. There's a film, Magic Bullet, with Edward G. Robinson, that shows how it's romanticized, but it's documentary in a way, and it shows how people would change drastically their symptoms when receiving Salvarsan. Like the blind man would come and got out of the clinic seeing everything, or the person in canes would come and then started running. All of that. It was revolutionary, but it was very toxic also. So it poisoned the system, and some years after, it caused more problems than it solved. So it was a breakthrough, and it's the one that is mostly associated with a magic bullet, something that is specific to that problem that brings the salvation or redemption, and that fits very well one thing that you're very familiar with in medicine, which is the language of war, fighting the enemy, a precise bullet, a precise weapon, a target, all of that. So Salvarsan epitomizes that perfectly, and only in the 40s, even though it was found a little bit earlier, did something really more effective, which was penicillin. Penicillin became a total breakthrough in the treatment of syphilis. It's not over, but it changed what was the scenery. So, like in AIDS, once effective therapy comes available, the apparatus for prevention loses some of its ground, because one of the arguments for prevention is there's no treatment available, so you really have to invest in prevention, be it government, public health institutions, or at the grassroots. Okay, so I want you also to think on this when you approach new epidemics, because, for example, now penicillin, we may well be at the last days of the antibiotics age. I don't know how many of you are working on antibiotic resistance, but it's one of the major public health problems of today, is that maybe what we had for granted will no longer be for granted in the next decades, because the overuse of antibiotics or whatever other reasons which I cannot develop now may be causing the spread of superbugs, or the need to change our attitudes about treatment and prevention also. I can see, because we're talking generations, I can jump from my generation to yours. I remember that in Portugal and in Brazil, it was very easy to buy an antibiotic until a few years ago. You could, even without a prescription, you can buy an antibiotic. Not the same in the US, not the same in many other places. And now it changed. They finally understood, or the agencies made them follow those, abide by those rules, that you cannot support the public demand for antibiotics unless it's really needed. So it's a knowledge attitudes towards preventing antibiotic resistance. Okay. So now to the point on representing disease. Remember the images, the scary images, the disturbing and unsettling images that were used for AIDS. I also have to share with you that often images used by health agencies and by government agencies that were commissioned to advertising agencies and so on were vetoed by activist organizations, because they use this technique of scaring the population, just like you have today on the cigarettes. Okay, scaring and then expecting changes in behavior by scaring. Okay, nobody in the activists ever accepted this, because this is one way that that unsettles you so much that you may well alienate the target, what should be the target population. That's something that we learned at least from AIDS. Now we have a long history of scary representation, and this I wasn't aware of. Even when I worked with AIDS, there are works relating syphilis propaganda, and because I did most of my training in the US, I wasn't familiar with some productions that exist mostly in Europe. There are in other places of the world also, but mostly in Europe, which is this tradition of wax models or molds representing a dermatological disease. I just didn't know of them, and it wasn't just me. It was most people I shared this with never heard of this, and now there's like year 2015, 2016, there's a new interest on this. Even in Brooklyn, there's now a museum of anatomical pathology that has moulages and all of that. So this is one piece that shows one primary lesion of a syphilis infection, which is very common. You can come up with a wound in a genital or near the lip or somewhere in the face, in the finger, anywhere, it's the first warning sign of syphilis. Then it can be treated with mercury and so on, and then it may come back. It naturally, generally would come back with longer rashes, and then could be treated, and then would come back again, like with the syphilis madness. You know from the literature, so many people, Guy de Maupassant, Flaubert, Schubert, Schumann, Beethoven, and, long list of celebrities that lived with syphilis this way, with coming back and forth, and some of them narrating it, some of them hiding it. It was something that you lived with. Now, from the medical perspective, one of the points was to objectify this, take away the sin, blaming, reckless sex, whatever, but objectify what is there, what's going on there on syphilis. And the molds, the anatomical molds, were a good way to objectify the symptoms and therefore the disease. So this is one of those pieces that you can find in Lisbon, or of that you might not be able to visit during this time unless you stay for next week. But I ran into this collection when the hospital of the Stier was dismantled, and they had been syphilis hospital, that hospital. I'm going to show you images on that. And I was awed. The word is, what is this? I had never seen anything like that in my life. And then I went after the history behind that collection. Now, as part of my research for the history of that collection, I ran into this other image. Anybody from Napoli here? No? The second image to the right, as you see, I made a shot of a TV screen of a documentary that's rare. It's in cassettes that no longer can be played except in very exceptional places. It was at the Wellcome Collection in London, and supposedly it's a figure that everybody in Napoli heard about, or not everybody, but many people heard about, but nobody really saw. Like I found maybe one or two persons that claimed to have seen, but everybody talks about it. It's like I've been asking this for 6 or 7 years, and they always say, "Oh yeah, La Scandalosa." And but have you seen it? Oh no, I never seen it. So this La Scandalosa, supposedly a prostitute that was sculptured to show what happens to you with syphilis. But I have to shorten. You think, the name La Scandalosa, it's not an objectification of the symptoms. It's, in my view, a moral message. She's a scandalous prostitute, and that's how you end up if you go on into this. Maybe it was a poetic, maybe it was a moral message, whatever. The whole message about morals and behavior and symptoms comes together packed in this image. I refer to it as the Rosetta Stone of wax modeling, but I haven't seen it yet. I tried 3 times going to Napoli and still couldn't get it. So these are the moulages, and this is not syphilis, by the way. It could be the secondary syphilis, something else. I put a lot of questions to the moulages. I'm going to run more because I want you to put questions. These are some of the pieces of the collection. You can see there are body details, there are genitals, there are tongues, there are syphilis accidents, some other dermatological symptoms that appear there, and they are all sculptured is not the right word, because they are molded. They were subject to casts. Real people with lesions were casted, and then a 3-dimensional positive was made on wax and colored. Okay. From your faces, I think that you may not have seen this before. Be ready, because it's now in high fashion with a museum, and during the last month, twice it appeared in the Atlas Obscura and the stuff that never ever appeared. Where is it? It's kept in one of the annexes of, like, there was a former convent that turned into a hospital, and now they have the room allocated for collections. So we can benefit, as a society can benefit from the support of an hospital to keep a medical collection, and it's visited by medical students and by whoever wants to go. Why is it there? There was an hospital that was dismantled in 2007 as part of the gentrification of the area, as part of the renovation of the public health services and the treatment services. So when that hospital, which is Desterro, which is downtown, very close to where you're going tonight, you can see it was also had been a convent. And the thing I didn't know when I was doing this research was that in that place there had been a leprosarium, a big leper colony in the Middle Ages. So maybe the convent, we have no evidence to support it, but I suspect that the convent was made there with some links to the leprosarium. So there's a long history of association with dread skin diseases and this place of offering assistance and keeping memory and also producing knowledge about skin and the venereal disease that's longer, even longer than the history of syphilis, because leprosy was there much before. Okay, why was this made? Well, long story. I can't go into all these details. Two doctors that I should sign. One that humanized the services of venereal disease. Just to a brief history behind. That's one in the left, Tomás. And the second, Luís, it was the one that now we know ordered the moulage to be made. Okay, they were made between 1935 and 1945, which makes us, one of us in the project, think that it might have been a refugee from the German-speaking worlds, where moulages were more used. There were bigger collections, and the technique was well advanced. Now, for the first doctor, before it, prostitution was legal as part of the prevention, public health prevention policies. Okay, there were, if you care to study sexually transmitted diseases, you will always find a tension between prohibitionism and regulation. Okay, AIDS, the same thing. Other. Maybe, I don't know if Zika will bring up that or not, but the tension between regulating in order to have a control and prohibiting in order to either not promote inappropriate behaviors, whether from a moralistic religious point of view or from a secularist point of view. Okay. The debates about prostitution still are about that today, and about drug use, same. Prohibition versus regulation, always get there. So Portugal was for regulation, like most continental Europe, and that implied that there was a sanitary police, going after the prostitutes, the sex workers, having them enroll in their booklets and having them checked every week for venereal symptoms. If they were caught with venereal symptoms, they were put away from society. Okay, so think about leprosy. Leprosy, when it was very apparent in Middle Ages and before, people were expelled from society and put in special places. And the syphilis symptoms were not so visible. Often they were in the genitals. So the sanitary police, with their doctors, inspected the genitals of the sex workers and decided whether they were okay to circulate or had to be excluded. Where did they end up? In some more prisons than infirmaries. And first it was in what is now Miguel Bombarda, and then they were put in Desterro, which is that hospital. So there was like a dumpster where the declared infected prostitutes were put. That was Desterro. And this doctor humanized the services and brought in bed sheets and material conditions to have their quality of life embittered and the treatment embittered. So it was a big change, and we have the sources. We have his clinical sources. Okay. Where was it? This is another view from Desterro, and long story, but this is where you're going tonight. around here, and it was the center of cheapest brothels and lower class street sex. Okay, so it was very close to the source where not only venereal infection occurred, but also where the sanitary police could harvest more easily, because there were other brothels also, but the expensive brothels could have the doctor coming in and have the person infected being treated apart and so on. So it was a place where the most destitute sex workers were put in. So you can imagine it was a place of intense suffering, resistance, tensions, and you name it. More aspects of the collection. Why were they made in the 30s? Shortest explanation, even though we always think that it's for medical education to use in classroom, what we really think is that they were used to keep a moment, freeze a moment, objectify the knowledge of syphilis, because every case may show up differently. So there was a need to fix in three-dimensional ways in the way it was used in the 19th century for before there were color photographs and the like, and then there was later to be photographed to illustrate articles. Okay, we have several examples. Here is the moulage photographed by us, and here's the moulage used to illustrate a medical article. Same. Who made it? We don't know. Thomas is the author of this book and is the biggest specialist, and he came to us to help identifying, and they are not signed. That's why we think maybe it was a refugee, but that's not the issue. Now, the long story of representation behind them. Should shut up now? Like 5 minutes more? Okay. Moulages in more less sophisticated forms have been used in many ways for moral purposes. Okay, you have ex-photos with body parts. We have these are in Bonfim, Bahia, but you can find them here in Lisbon too. And the 18th century art of molding the body to objectify anatomy. Now here, it's not about pathological anatomy, it's about anatomy, period. And like drawing, it replaced the use of actual corpses, even though for making every single piece, you had to use several corpses. So it was kind of an investment in the future. I use 10 corpses now, and then I spared the next generation from using 100. Maybe that's one of the explanations. But my point is there are moral messages attached to the molds also. These are Ercolilelli, Adam and Eve. I think Adam and Eve carries biblical reference. It's not just anatomy of a man and a woman. Okay, these are Venuses. Messages may not be just religious. They can be erotic. They can be about life, about you judge by yourself. So these are, you can find in Florence, in Bologna, in Vienna, these molded and sculpted images, three-dimensional models of men and women in layers. So the moulage that I showed you on dermatology and syphilis inherited from this technique. And this technique inherits, in a way, from the representations that were made on purpose to scare you and to bring you the notion that behavior and morals bring disease and decay, like the scandalos I show you. Okay, more of these, more. These are in the Josephine, were Italian pieces too that were brought. Analytic literature says that these were very important displays, but the surgeons and physicians in charge of transmitting knowledge were not so keen about this. They said nothing replaces a real corpse. and this is decorating, but it's not really useful for teaching. Okay. There are also some rare cases that you can find using actual specimens. This was the body of a horse and the body of a man, plastified by Fragonard, and you can find it in the Veterinary Museum in Paris. Go there to see it. It's exhibited to the public. It's the same principle that is used now in the bodies exhibit, which is actual bodies plastified with the newer techniques. Okay, pathological anatomy, you can find it more hidden away. This is very disturbing to look at this. I apologize to you to show this species, but warned in the beginning. It's very disturbing to go see this piece. So generally, you have to ask, except for the one in Austria, where you can you can enter, even children can go in. You generally have to ask permission, be a medical student, be a researcher, and so on, to go and see this. And curators, this is in Bologna, an incredible collection too. Also not accessible to the public. You have to ask. Now in Vienna, Vienna has anybody from Vienna here? No, a longer tradition of intimacy with pathological anatomy. There are more than 10 pathological anatomy institutes in town, and have a freer access to the collections. Except I only took this picture because you cannot take pictures there. But you go to their site; it's incredible. It's fantastic. Now, behind that history, again, another Rosetta Stone, Gaetano Zumbo, probably Sicilian artist, that was also a religious man, and made these pictures. They seem very big, but it's this size, so it's very incredible waxwork on decay, human decay, plague, life and death, syphilis, okay? And this is a detail on syphilis, a miniature figure, this size, where it's both anatomical objectification. This happened when I told you, the 16th century, you'd lose your nose, you'd lose your hair, and people say that the wigs fashion and the makeup fashion was to hide syphilis symptoms in the 18th century. And this is another Rosetta Stone, and this is back to La Scandalosa. So you have, in my perspective, it's my argument, there's a link between the moral messages made in wax from the so-called graveyard art that comes out in La Scandalosa to and in Zomo to the objectification. So we are making objective three-dimensional visions of disease, but we are also engaging with moral messages. That's basically what I wanted to say. This is Ospedale, where more Napoli, a lot of representation, and now I finally got a more precise image of La Scandalosa in one rare book on the hospital. And you can see it's not just syphilis, it's like decay in general, because if you put the mice, you probably are saying also plague, and you're saying human vulnerability. And you'll have much more happy presentations today. I'm sorry I woke you up with these scary images, and I'm also saying it's kind of a farewell to this side of medical anthropology, because I'm engaging in a new project. Thanks for being so attentive, and feel free to ask any questions.